My name is Renee Delaney and welcome to Small Scale Farms. I run a social enterprise in the Niagara region that focuses on food security, and I believe social services from a community standpoint, which essentially just means I'm here to help you whether you can afford to eat or not. And that's really important to me because I am a single mom of two, and I've struggled in the past to find an adequate food source for my children and myself. And so that has led me down quite the rabbit hole of what the current food system, or lack thereof, is actually about, and what it is that it could be if we wanted to design one ourselves. And so what I did was essentially, I knew I had to move out to the country. I had to get out of the city and provide a very specific life for my children that involved a lot of outdoor time and involved some education on growing their own food. And so for me, it also became about being able to pay my rent without throwing my kids in daycare and living this very busy, hectic life that really provided no quality for both me or my children. And so I found a house that actually needed some fixing up, and I asked the gentleman who owned the house if he was willing to negotiate on the rent. So I actually found a house out in the country that enabled me to start learning how to fix things myself. I had to ask for help. I had to learn how to rip out a floor and put in new taps in my sink, and essentially just start the journey of taking care of myself and asking for help when I wasn't sure how to use a drill, for example. I had never actually picked up any tools before that point. So it was this journey of figuring out who I was, but also how to take care of myself, and taking any of the bills off the table that I could helped create a freedom that I was really starting to crave. I had gone to school to be a homeopath, so to work with natural medicine. And I started to work in the health industry, and essentially I figured out that no matter where I went, I was just getting closed in with this mentality of capitalizing not just on another's well-being, but capitalizing, everybody seemed to be capitalizing wherever they could to profit. And I just started to wonder if there was a way we could create a system that just wasn't solely focused on profit. And I started experimenting with different currencies. For example, if my work was producing an ability to live for cheap, then what if I grew food, right? Not only would I be taking a grocery bill off of the table, I would be taking, I would have the ability to also provide that food to, say, my neighbor or to people down the street, etc. So food was a currency as well. And I never really considered that before. I had never grown my own food. Everyone says farming is just so hard. Why would anybody do it for a career? And essentially, I didn't think I was going to actually be a farmer, to be honest. I just wanted to provide for my family, but it brought up all of these questions, and I found that those questions needed answering. A lot of people actually always ask me if, how I started. And while I have that story of being a single mom and the need to grow my own food, to provide for my family, I also have the story of who's who in Niagara. And the reason why I started to explore who was who in Niagara was because it actually started as a nonprofit. And I found myself in a sector with other nonprofits who each had a mission and a vision, right? A million times I've been asked for, what's my mission? What's my vision? And I found it funny that we all seem to be wanting to help feed people. And at the time I thought, oh, that's great. People need food. There's a certain demographic or certain percentage of our population that, like myself, that was actually in need and would typically need support and charity. But otherwise, I was starting to dive into a food system that seemed very capitalistic and very influenced by purchasing power. So those in our community, for example, if you thought of who the major grocery chains were, how was it that they were distributing was a really big question of mine. But also, how did it work? Where was the food coming from? And how in general did not just Ontario and Niagara specifically function, but how did Canada function? How does Canada import and export? What do they import and export? So there's this base of, okay, we have these nonprofits who are moving a significant amount of food and a significant amount of funds through their organizations. But then we also have corporations that are straight across the country. So of course, looking into logistics, I want to know not just how that system functions, but how I can apply similar knowledge, because clearly it was working. Clearly we as a people have fully accepted that that is the grocery store model, and this is how this system works. So much so, I started to believe the whole thing was just made up, and we, in our acceptance of it, made it real, made it a fact of life. And so what if we could create a new system that actually kept money in the community? You hear all the time about economic development, for example. So I went into the region and I asked, what is economic development to the Niagara region? How can you explain those words, right? Because we say things like ecosystem and we say things like economic development, but we don't fully unpack what it means. So I was very interested in their answer, and unfortunately for me and for us in general, the answer at the time, this was probably about 4 years ago, the answer at the time was foreign investment. And that just really didn't make sense to me. And so especially once I started to figure out food was a currency and that everybody eats, and that we didn't have our own food system or a way to logistically distribute that food to our own residents. And there was nothing local about it. So I really went back to the drawing board, to be honest, after that point, and thought to myself, well, if they can make up an economy, I can make up an economy. And I started to look into things like the circular economy and what it means to think outside of the box. What is it, when somebody says this is how things are, what is it that little old me would have the ability to manipulate and change for good? And really it became pretty obvious that it would only come through small scale farming on a large scale. If you had a farm and I had a farm and there was a lot of farms, then we would be keeping that money in the community. We'd be spending that money with a farmer, and we'd have that money returned to us eventually, because it wasn't just shooting out the door into the corporation's hands. And if you thought about it, then that would actually drive a lot more stability for local food, because as a farmer, I'd have not a guaranteed income. There is still risk in farming, but certainly I would be able to be sure that you would buy our food. And that piece is really important, because what started to happen over time, even though I knew this knowledge, I was starting to see farmers just quit. And nobody, in the family specifically, I would hear somebody in the 55, 60-year-old range say, I don't want my children to be farmers. And that also was quite devastating to me, because I knew there was going to be a massive gap and it was approaching fast. So even though we may think of Niagara as this glorious fruit belt, another thing I was uncovering was what conventional farming was doing to our environment. And, small scale farming had none of those consequences. So I was inadvertently backing the need for regenerative farming. And so then I had to start looking at soil and what it was that soil had to do with anything, because I knew that the greenhouses were not necessarily growing in soil. And I wanted to figure out what was in the water, what is fertilizer, what is synthetic, what is real. And that's a really fascinating rabbit hole if you choose to go down that and explore that, because the vitamins and minerals that we need in our bodies are actually coming from the fruit of that plant. So say a pepper, it's actually taking the vitamins and minerals out of the soil, and it's like a vehicle. That pepper is transporting those minerals into your body. And that pepper was designed to suit your body perfectly. And yet, if we tamper with that in any way, whether it be synthetic fertilizers in water or messing with the DNA of a seed, then I was starting to gather evidence that there was consequences much larger than we were willing to bear. So now, if that's the case, now we really have to figure out what the next step is, because here's this understanding that we're in trouble, and we're going to be in more trouble in a minute. So how is it when you approach politics, or when you approach the current system that doesn't want to change, how is it that you can start seeing change without too much disturbance? And so that kind of brings us to the next point for me in my journey, was that I had to get really smart really fast, because I didn't know that COVID was coming, and yet it came. And fortunately for me, I was in position, but it meant maneuvering and building as fast as possible. So for me, we've kind of come to this standstill. And at this point in time, I wish I had this beautifully scripted plan as to how it's all going to get better. But unfortunately, I see a lot of work ahead and not enough people raising their hands to help. And for me, what that means, given that I've seen that through and through over time, for me, that means I'd like to create more infrastructure. So people want to help, but they just don't know how. And so small scale farms essentially is creating that, okay, you can dip your toe in, you can see what we're all about, you can learn a little bit more about the food system so that you understand the depth of the issues, so that you are inspired to change your habits first and foremost. But beyond that, I think it's really important that each one of us start to get to know our community a little bit better, our neighbors a little bit better. Our habits need to be looked at. And of course, purchasing from small scale farmers at this point in the game is going to create the purchasing power that's going to be able to leverage and create availability of the food that was traditionally available to us, basically in our backyards. We want to make sure that we do not lose control of our own food system because it's already starting to slide. So buying from farmers changes that game. That gives us the basis from which we can build our communities. So next time you're out and about, and it doesn't matter what region you're in, you can find a farmer's market. You can find a farm stand that you could buy your produce from versus going to the grocery store. Let alone wherever you're getting your meat from, supporting a small scale farmer and putting money in their hands right now. Essentially, when you're buying from farmers, you're creating this ability for your community to thrive, but you are a part of that community. And if COVID taught us anything, it should be that we need to be in control of our own health. We need to make sure that we understand our own biology and our own physiology, our own anatomy, because that empowers us to make decisions that keep us healthy. So the food, in combination with the knowledge, is actually all for you. When I ask the community to come help, I already know that we're trying to provide you with something. But when you step up and you decide to give, you find yourself in a position where you're a lot healthier and your quality of life has improved. So for us, I mean, we'd love to join forces with any nonprofits, any for-profits, any government, anyone who has any kind of lead in the food system area, and start to collaborate in a very real way. So that you don't even have to be a part of any of those organizations. That could just be your commitment to not accept what's happening in the current system and not just stop there, but build what it is that you do want for yourself. So if you'd like to get a hold of us, we're 13145 Lundy's Lane in Niagara, and we actually have a really great website that you could look over that shows you, okay, these are local products, local produce. Is it perfect? Is it entirely local? No, there's no local in January. There's not a lot of local in January. So we're just trying to build that bridge. So smallscalefarms.ca if you want to check that out. Or of course on social media, you can find me ranting on any given day if you follow Small Scale Farms on social media. Thank you, and I hope that everyone understands that it's our responsibility to create the change that we want to see for ourselves.